What if I told you that inside the walls of Buckingham Palace, one of the quietest, most disciplined figures in the entire royal family has just been handed a level of authority no one saw coming? Not William, not Camilla, not the men in gray who have run the machinery of the monarchy for decades, but Princess Anne. The daughter nobody underestimated, and yet somehow everyone overlooked. By the end of this video, you will know exactly what King Charles has quietly done, why he has done it now, and why insiders are calling this the single most consequential internal decision of his entire reign. Before we go any further, hit subscribe, because this story will leave you speechless, and it is only just beginning to unfold. The date is late spring 2025, somewhere inside the private working corridors of Buckingham Palace. A door closes softly, and a decision that had been whispered about for months finally becomes real. Stay with this, because to understand what just happened, you have to understand who Princess Anne has always been. She is not a woman who chases cameras. She is not a woman who leaks. She is not a woman who plays the long, poisonous games of palace politics. For more than 50 years, she has been the royal who simply worked. Over 500 engagements a year, sometimes 600. More than any other member of the family. More than her mother in the later years. More than her brothers combined. While Charles was building his environmental legacy, while Andrew was collapsing under the weight of his own scandals, while Edward was searching for a role that fit, Anne was on trains, in the rain, in hospitals, at regimental dinners, at charity openings, quietly holding the monarchy together with nothing but stamina and duty. And here's the thing. Nobody outside the family truly understood how much Charles relied on her. Not the press, not the public, not even most of the household staff. Because the bond between Charles and Anne is not the bond of headlines. It is the bond of two children who grew up inside the coldest, most controlled institution on earth, and who learned, very young, that the only person who could truly understand what that felt like was the sibling standing beside them. Think about that for a moment. Charles and Anne were the only two children of Queen Elizabeth for a decade before Andrew was born. They shared nannies, they shared corridors, they shared the terrifying, echoing silence of a childhood spent watching their mother disappear into red boxes and state papers. And when Charles struggled, publicly, painfully, through the collapse of his first marriage, through the loss of Diana, through years of being mocked as a king in waiting who might never wear the crown, it was Anne who never wavered, never briefed against him, never gave a single interview that could be twisted, never, in more than half a century, embarrassed the family she was born into. So when the announcement came in February 2024 that King Charles had been diagnosed with cancer, the palace machine went into a very particular kind of quiet panic. Because a monarchy is not just a family, it is a visibility engine. It has to be seen. It has to appear. It has to walk into rooms and shake hands and cut ribbons and lay wreaths, or the entire mystique begins to crack. And with Charles suddenly withdrawn from public duties, with Kate simultaneously stepping back for her own cancer treatment, with William narrowing his focus to protect his wife and children, the palace faced a hole in its schedule the size of a continent. And here is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. Because the person who stepped into that hole, without hesitation, without a press release, without a single word of self-congratulation, was the 73-year-old princess who had already been working harder than anyone else in the family for decades. Anne did not just cover for her brother, she absorbed the weight of an entire institution. But here's where it gets even more chilling for anyone who thought they understood how this family operates. Because what Charles has now done, quietly, in the months following his return to partial duties, is something the palace has not done in living memory. He has formally extended Anne's authority over key palace responsibilities in a way that goes far beyond ceremonial cover. Sources close to the family describe it as a working transfer of trust. Not a title, not a crown, not a public elevation. Something quieter and in many ways far more powerful. A structural shift in who actually makes the decisions when the king is not in the room. Ask yourself something. When was the last time you saw a British monarch willingly hand a sibling that much operational reach? Not in the Victorian era. Not under George V. Not under Elizabeth, who kept her sister Margaret carefully at arm's length from the working core of the throne. This is, by any honest historical measure, unprecedented. And it is happening now, in real time, inside a palace that built its entire identity on control. To understand the weight of it, you have to understand what Anne already carried before this shift. She is colonel-in-chief of regiments across 3 continents. She is patron or president of more than 300 charities. She is the only royal to have competed in an Olympic Games. She is the woman who, in 1974, when a man tried to kidnap her at gunpoint on the Mall, looked him in the eye and reportedly said, "Not bloody likely." That is not a line. That is a personality. That is the spine of a woman who has spent her entire life refusing to be moved. And now that spine is holding up the monarchy itself. Insiders describe scenes that would have been unthinkable even 5 years ago. Anne chairing preparatory meetings that would once have been chaired by the sovereign's private secretary alone. Anne being consulted on Commonwealth visits before Charles signs off. Anne quietly reviewing the diaries of younger royals, gently redirecting, gently reshaping, gently reminding them what the job actually is. Staff who have worked in the palace for decades say they have never seen the internal chain of command look quite like this. One royal watcher described it as a monarchy with 2 centers of gravity. The king and his sister. But here's the part nobody expected. Camilla, according to those monitoring the family's internal dynamics, has not resisted this shift. Not publicly. Not privately. And that, in itself, is a story worth pausing on. Because Camilla, for all her polish, has spent years quietly securing her own footprint inside the palace. Her own household, her own advisors, her own carefully protected influence. And yet when Anne began stepping into the operational vacuum left by Charles's illness, Camilla did not push back. Because she understood perhaps better than anyone that Anne is not a rival. Anne does not want the crown. Anne does not want the spotlight. Anne wants the work done. And in a palace where almost everyone wants something, a woman who wants nothing except duty is the most powerful figure in the room. If you have made it this far, hit like. Because what comes next is the part of the story most people have never heard, and it explains everything about why Charles made this choice now, and not 5 years ago. Rewind to the winter of 2024. Charles is in treatment. The details are being held tightly. Only a handful of people know how serious it truly is, and Anne is one of them. Sources describe her arriving at Clarence House and later at Sandringham without fanfare, without a motorcade, without the theatrical entrances that mark so many royal movements. She drives herself. She always has. She parks. She walks in. She sits with her brother, and according to those familiar with the visits, she does not talk about the monarchy, she does not talk about succession, she does not talk about the press. She talks about their childhood, about their mother, about the horses, about the quiet things that only the 2 of them remember. And in one of those conversations, sometime in the early months of 2024, Charles is said to have asked her, plainly without ceremony, whether she would take on more, not for a season, not as a stopgap, but as a permanent widening of her role. And Anne, characteristically, is said to have answered with a single sentence, "Of course." No negotiation, no conditions, no request for a title or a house or a stipend, just the 2 words that have defined her entire life. Of course. Think about that for a moment. Think about what it means. In a family that has been torn apart by leaked memoirs, by Oprah interviews, by legal battles over security details, by public accusations traded on international television, for one sibling to say to another, in the middle of a cancer diagnosis, "Of course." No conditions, no leverage, no angle. That is the moment insiders now believe that everything changed, not the announcement, not the paperwork, not the quiet reshuffling of responsibilities in the months that followed, but that single conversation between a king and his sister in a room with no cameras and no courtiers. And here is where the ripple effects begin to spread outward into every corner of the family. Because the moment Anne's authority expanded, the internal geometry of the monarchy shifted. William, according to those who watch the household closely, has drawn even closer to his aunt. Not out of obligation, but out of genuine trust. He knows she will never brief against him. He knows she will never leak. He knows that in a palace where information is currency, she is the one person who has never, in 50 years, spent a single coin against her own family. Kate, too, is said to have leaned on Anne during the most difficult months of her recovery, not for public appearances, for something quieter, for advice on how to disappear when the world demands you appear, for guidance on how to protect children inside an institution that has never quite learned how to let children be children. Anne, who raised her own 2 children, Peter and Zara, deliberately without royal titles, deliberately outside the machinery, deliberately as ordinary as royal children can ever be, is uniquely qualified to give that advice. And she gives it, sources say, in the same way she does everything else. Quietly, directly, without a single wasted word. But there is another dimension to this story, and it is the one the palace would prefer you did not think about too carefully. Because the expansion of Anne's authority is not just a gesture of sibling love. It is a strategic reinforcement of the monarchy at a moment when the institution is more fragile than at any point since the death of Diana. Harry and Meghan remain across the Atlantic, their relationship with the palace strained to a thread. Andrew remains in exile at Royal Lodge, a lingering scandal that no amount of silence can fully bury. The king is managing a serious illness. The Princess of Wales is protecting her recovery. And the future king, William, is being deliberately shielded from the daily grind of ceremonial duty so that he can be a father first. Which means that the visible, working, functioning monarchy, the one that shows up in hospitals and at memorials and at Commonwealth gatherings, the one that reminds the country and the world that the crown is still there, still steady, still doing the work, is being carried, day after day, by a woman who has never once asked for credit. Not a press release, not a public elevation, not a crown. A quiet, controlled, deliberate widening of trust, granted in private, exercised in silence. And here's the thing. That is exactly the kind of power Anne has always understood. Not the noisy power of headlines, not the fragile power of popularity, but the deep structural power of being the person everyone else relies on when the room goes quiet. Her mother had it. Her mother wielded it for 70 years. And now, in a way nobody quite predicted, her daughter is wielding it too. Royal historians are already beginning to describe this period as the Anne interregnum. Not in the technical sense, because Charles remains king and remains fully sovereign, but in the practical sense, in the sense that matters to the people who actually keep a monarchy running, the diaries and the private secretaries and the Lord Chamberlains and the household staff. In that sense, Anne is, for the first time in modern royal history, functioning as something close to a co-regent, without the title, without the ceremony, without the crown. And perhaps that is exactly why it works, because the British monarchy has always been at its most powerful when it is at its least theatrical, when it simply is, when it does the work, when it shows up in the rain, at the regimental dinner, at the hospice, at the Veterans Hall, without complaint and without fanfare. And no living member of the family has embodied that principle more completely than Princess Anne. Ask yourself something. In an age of leaks, of memoirs, of Netflix documentaries, of carefully staged photographs and carefully curated narratives, when was the last time you heard Anne complain? When was the last time you heard her defend herself? When was the last time you heard her explain? You cannot remember, because it has not happened. She does not explain. She does not defend. She does not complain. She simply keeps going. Engagement after engagement, decade after decade, a woman built for a job that has broken almost everyone else who has ever tried to do it. And now, in the twilight of her brother's reign, At an age when most people are long retired, she is doing more than she has ever done. Not less. More, and the palace, quietly, without a single official statement, has recognized it. Charles has recognized it. William has recognized it. Even Camilla, in her own careful, watchful way, has recognized it. There will be no coronation for what has happened, no ceremony, no robe, no orb, no scepter. That is not how this transfer of trust works. It works in closed rooms and short conversations and pieces of paper that never see the public eye. It works in the way a diary is arranged, in the way a decision is deferred, in the way a private secretary now checks 2 calendars instead of 1 before confirming a royal engagement. It works, in short, exactly the way Anne herself has always worked. Quietly, precisely, without applause. And yet the consequences of it will echo for a generation. Because when the history of Charles's reign is finally written, when the biographers sit down with their access and their archives and their careful reconstructions of who did what and when, the story they tell will not be the story of a king who ruled alone. It will be the story of a king who, at the most vulnerable moment of his life, turned to the sister who had never once let him down and asked her to help him carry the weight. And she said, of course. Think about the loyalty required for that. Think about the discipline. Think about the half-century of small, unglamorous, uncelebrated choices that made it possible. Every regimental visit, every ribbon cut in a small English town nobody had heard of, every trip to a Commonwealth country that would never make the front page. Every moment she chose the work over the spotlight, the duty over the drama, the family over the headline. All of it, quietly accumulating until the day her brother, the king, needed someone he could trust with the machinery of the monarchy itself. And there was only ever one answer, her. That is the truth of what has happened inside Buckingham Palace. Not a scandal, not a coup, not a reshuffle, something rarer and in many ways more moving. A recognition, at last, that the person who has always done the work is the person who should be trusted to keep doing it, at the highest level, with the fullest authority for as long as she is willing. And she will be willing, because she always has been. But there is one more person we have not talked about yet. Because every shift of power inside the royal family creates a shadow, and the shadow of Anne's expanded role falls in a very specific direction. It falls on the next generation. On William. On Kate. On the children who will one day inherit a monarchy that is being quietly rebuilt around them. Right now, in rooms they are not yet allowed to enter. And what happens next, as Anne's influence begins to shape the way those children are prepared for the crown, may be even more consequential than anything Charles has done so far. If you have made it this far, hit like, because stories like this one do not stay buried for long, and the details are only just beginning to surface. Subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. Because the next chapter of this family's story is already being written in the quiet corridors of a palace that has finally learned who it truly depends on. And somewhere inside that palace, tonight, a 73-year-old princess is reviewing tomorrow's diary. She will not speak about it. She will not post about it. She will not brief a single journalist. She will simply close the folder, turn out the light, and be ready, as she has always been ready, at dawn. Because that is who she is. That is who she has always been. And now, at last, the country is beginning to understand that the strongest figure inside the House of Windsor was never the one on the throne. It was the one standing quietly beside it, all along.